that I have with me, but I believe that the thing that had the most influence in me was the fact that they always stood for their principles, and I believe that that's exactly what everyone who is testifying at these hearings is doing. You know, we're not really driven by a political agenda, but we're driven by, you know, our human nature. You know, the nature that tells you that, you know, you should not travel halfway across the world to brutalize a country for no reason.
Camilo Mejia is a former Army Staff Sergeant, Army Guard from Florida. Here at the Winter Soldier, the accounts that will be given this weekend of the occupations and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The book about his experience has just come out in paperback that he wrote, The Road to Aramati. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, we'll be joined by David Courtwright. He was there during the Vietnam War. He'll talk about those original hearings. We will also be joined by Dennis Kucinich to talk about the secret session of Congress, the congressman from Cleveland. Stay with us.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, I marched to the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the early British War. The young land started growing, the young blood started flowing, but I ain't marching anymore. For I killed my share of Injuns in 1,000 different fights. I was there at the Little Big Horn. I heard many men lying, I saw many more dying, but I ain't marching anymore. It's always the old to lead us to the wars, always the young to fall. Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all? For I stole California from the Mexican land, fought in the bloody Civil War. Yes, I even killed my brothers and so many others, but I ain't marching anymore. For I marched to the battles of the German trench in a war that was bound to end all wars. Oh, I must have killed 1 million men and now they want me back again, but I ain't marching anymore. It's always the old to lead us to the wars, always the young to fall. Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all? For I flew the final mission in the Japanese sky, set off the mighty mushroom roar. When I saw the cities burning, I knew that I was...
I ain't marching anymore. Phil Oakes here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from National Labor College just outside Washington, D.C. in Silver Spring. Hundreds of veterans, active duty soldiers, soldiers who've just returned from Iraq and Afghanistan are here to testify in the second Winter Soldier hearing. We're going to go back now, though, in time to February 1971, to the original Winter Soldier.
First day I got to Vietnam, I landed in Da Nang Air Base, got off the plane, and hitchhiked on Highway 1 to my unit. I was picked up by a truckload of grunt Marines with 2 company-grade officers, first lieutenants. We were about 5 miles down the road where there were some Vietnamese children at the gateway of the village, and they gave the old finger gesture at us. It was understandable that they picked us up from the GIs there. They stopped the truck. They didn't stop the truck. They slowed down a little bit, and it was just like response. The guys got up, including the lieutenants, and just blew all the kids away. There was about 5 or 6 kids blown away there, and then the truck just moved, continued down the hill. That was my first day in Vietnam. In Quang Tri City, I had a friend who was he was working with USAID, and one time he asked me would I like to accompany him to watch. He was an advisor with an ARVN group, and he asked me if I would like to accompany him into a village that I was familiar with to see how they act. So I went with them, and they didn't find any enemy, but they found a woman with bandages. So she was questioned she was questioned by 6 ARVNs, and the way they questioned her was, since she had bandages, they shot her. She was hit about 20 times. So after she was questioned, of course dead, this guy come over who was, and knowing him, he was a former major. He was in the service for 20 years, and he got hungry again and came back over working with USAID, Aid International Development. And he went over there and ripped her clothes off and took a knife and cut from her vagina all the way up, well, just about up to her breast, and pulled her organs out completely out of her cavity and threw them out. And then he stopped and knelt over and commenced to peel every bit of skin off her body and left her there as a sign for something or other.
That was the testimony from Winter Soldier, the hearing in February of 1971. It took place in Detroit. We're joined by David Courtwright right now. He is a Vietnam War veteran, author of the landmark book Soldiers in Revolt, GI Resistance During the Vietnam War, now a professor of peace studies at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to Democracy Now! Professor Courtwright, tell us about these Winter Soldier hearings, the gory descriptions, the atrocities these soldiers are describing they engaged in themselves.
Yeah, this was part of our experience during the GI movement, the resistance movement of the soldiers and veterans in the Vietnam era. And many of us who were part of that experience learned that what we had been told by our leaders was false, it was a lie, and what we saw on the ground was horrible. And our political leaders put the armed forces in a situation that was impossible. It was a criminal situation. The policy itself was a crime. Free fire zones, the bombings, the destruction of villages, that was a common part of the routine of our experience during Vietnam, meant that soldiers were being asked to commit criminal acts. And those of us who were part of that increasingly spoke out. And the original hearing in 1971 was a powerful and dramatic event when more than 100, 150 veterans came and gave testimony. I was still in the Army at the time. I didn't participate, but I was stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas. And a couple months later, we had our own war crimes hearing among active duty soldiers and recent veterans at Fort Bliss. And we had more than a dozen come forward and talk about what had happened. One fellow had been a tail gunner in a helicopter, and he was particularly irate about the fact that Lieutenant Calley had been indicted for being involved with the My Lai massacre. And this soldier said, if Calley was guilty, I was guilty, because what I was told to do was to fly over territory and shoot anything that moved. So if there was a farmer out there with a water buffalo, we shot him. I was asked to do criminal acts while I was in Vietnam, and the whole policy was criminal. So it was a powerful but important testimony that our soldiers gave about the nature of this war, trying to wake up our country to the nature of this kind of policy.
What effect did the Winter Soldier hearing have? We know about it in 2004 because John Kerry ran for president, and he had attended, though not testified, at the Winter Soldier hearing in Detroit.
Well, I think the voice of the Vietnam veterans was critical to trying to change public opinion. We found later on that the Nixon administration was extremely upset about the VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. The whole spy operation that became Watergate was in part motivated by an attempt to undermine the voice and the legitimacy of the veterans. But we spoke with real authority. We were there on the ground. We could tell the truth to the American people about what was going on. And that voice was critically important in helping to broaden public understanding of the nature of the war, help to build anti-war opposition. I think that the voice of the veterans and the soldiers was critically important to forcing our political leaders to end that war. We know that Nixon and company ended the war not because they saw the folly of what the United States had done or they had changed their imperial policies. They changed the policy because the American people would not stand for it anymore, and the soldiers and the veterans who had actually fought the war spoke out to say, we are not going to participate in this kind of policy any longer.
When did the tide turn for soldiers? When was the voice, when did it become the loudest in the Vietnam War?
Well, if you look at the history of the GI movement, it really began to take off in 1968. And I think it was the whole Tet experience. And when we had been told that there was going to be progress, we were achieving the light at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam, and then along came Tet. The worst year of the war was
Explain
1968.
Tet.
Tet was the uprising,